I'm excited to bring you this morning the third sermon from our current series, Characteristics of a Christ-Centered Church. As we consider the purpose and value of being part of the body and part of the local church body, the local body of believers, we want to be completely sure and certain that the body is functioning in a way that would please Jesus in the way that he would desire for us. And it is so important that that it doesn't just become motions, but rather that the body is functioning, relating in a way that Jesus desires, and in a way that we are becoming more spiritually mature in the way that he would have us grow. And so this third message from Characteristics of a Christ-Centered Church is the way of humility. A Christ-centered church values others. The way of humility. I'd just like to run through quickly the previous two. Sermon 1, shared about a month ago, was the Christ-centered church is encouraging. It is an encouraging place. It is a life-giving place. A healthy body is not a group of people getting together to party because we have it together. Although I think we should get together and party. We have the best message on the planet. And it is embarrassing sometimes how shy we are about it. We should celebrate this, should we not? It is an encouraging place. It is a life-giving place, and that sermon came from the first psalm. Blessed is the one who doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. All right, the second sermon was a Christ-centered church honors God. And how do we do that? How do we honor God? It is through obedience. It is the way of obedience. And Jesus said 3 times in a very short time in the upper room as he's gathered with the disciples, and he said, I'm going to be killed. I'm going to be betrayed, turned over to people who are going to murder me. That's coming. And he goes on to say that, but I'm going to be leaving, but I'm giving you one that is going to stay with you. He will never leave you. He says the Holy Spirit, he calls it the Comforter. The Comforter is going to come, and he's going to be an advocate for you. He's going to comfort you, and what a promise, what good news that is. And 3 times he said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And later, whoever has and keeps my commandments loves me. And Jesus answered again on a 3rd time, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. That is good news. A Christ-centered church honors God through obedience. And so this morning, Sermon 3, a Christ-centered church values others. The way of humility. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul writes this, have this mind among you. Have this mind among you, which was also among Christ Jesus. Though he was in the form of God, did not think that equality with God was a thing he was able to grasp, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. So, what is the mind that we are to have? The mind like God's? Taking the form of a servant. I don't believe that there is a follower of God who is not also a servant. He became a servant. And being born in the likeness of men, he was fashioned in human form, and he humbled himself. What is the mind we're supposed to have? Humble ourselves. And for Jesus, it says, and he became obedient even to the point of death, even the death of the cross, the most shameful death imaginable. But therefore, because he humbled himself, because he emptied himself of everything, it says that God has exalted him. Friends, you and I, we love to be exalted, don't we? But God says the person who exalts himself will be humbled, and the person who humbles themselves will be exalted. And so, this morning, my encouragement is for us to value all other people by being humble. This is a hard sermon to preach. It's hard to preach on humility because every one of us deals with pride. Every single person. I'm nervous this morning. I'm likely going to say things that will offend some of you because it's so personal. I'm going to say things where you might look at me and say, Calvin, that's something you struggle with. You're probably right. Every single person deals with pride in some form or another. Some of us, we think we're so humble, which is pride. It's a tough topic, but is humility necessary? Does it matter how we view ourselves? Does it really matter how we think about ourselves? Does it matter if we really seek to be humble? Of course, the opposite of humility is pride. I'd like to go to the book of James, chapter 4. I'll draw a few verses from this book. James, chapter 4. Here is reason number one for us to seek humility. To not choose a posture and attitude of humility is to stand in opposition of God. And friends, I do not want to stand in opposition of the creator of the universe, the one who gave himself, gave his son, so that all who believe may have life. And I sure as anything do not want to be the one standing in the way of another person having life. But to choose, if we do not choose that attitude or posture of humility, we are standing in opposition to God, and we choose to place ourselves outside of his grace, because it says this is James, you already know this, the half-brother of Jesus, he grew up in the same house as Jesus, and he became a believer. We understand, I think that he only became a believer after Jesus rose from the dead. And he writes this, he, meaning God, gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Who here is not in need of grace? Every single person is in need of deep grace. I need it every day. I need the deep grace of God and grace from other people. And he says that God is in opposition. If someone is proud, he is in opposition to that. But it says that he extends his grace to the humble. It just makes me think of in Luke 18, a couple chapters later, where Jesus is talking about the two people a Pharisee, a religious person, and a publican who was a tax collector. He was the outcast of the society. The outcast, the societal outcast, and a publican are standing in the street praying. And it's just this, you should look it up. It's Luke 18, starting at verse 9. I won't, because I'm going to be long enough without reading it. But he says, the Pharisee, the religious person, says, God, thank you. I praise you. I thank you that you have given me my situation. I'm going to paraphrase here, but we do the exact same thing. It's downright scary. And one of the reasons that this message was so hard is time and again, I came back to, man, I'm a Pharisee. Man, do I get caught focusing on the wrong things. I don't want to be a Pharisee. What I'm saying, that's a confession. It's not something I desire to be. It is so easy to start focusing on the wrong things. But in Luke 18, the Pharisee, dear God, thank you for my situation. Thank you that you have given me my family, my home. You didn't make me like those other people. Are we not guilty of praying the same thing sometimes? And the tax collector, The publican, it says, he didn't even lift his hands or his eyes toward heaven. He just looked down and he said, "Dear God, have mercy on me. I'm a sinful person." And Jesus said, one of the two men is justified in his prayers. And you and I know who that is. Friends, he gives grace to the humble. If you think that you are better than another person, I pray that you would repent. If you think you have more value than any other person on the planet, I pray that you would repent. Because he gives grace to the humble. Pardon me. Every one of us is in desperate need of God's grace. Every one of us struggles with pride in some area of our life, and we are tempted to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. And that's in Romans chapter 12, verse 3, it says, "Let everyone among you not think of themselves more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment." But it's so easy because we love to be honored, do we not? Of course we do. If you go to, I'm going to talk a little bit about the parable of Jesus talks of going to a wedding. And I love going to weddings. Do you know what's best? Having a place of honor. You know, when you sort of look around and you see, I'm pretty close to the front. Am I the only one? We love to be honored. We love to receive the accolades. We love to be exalted. We love to be the best. We won. We are the best. We want people to notice us, to praise us, to compliment us. It is completely natural. But the natural person deals with pride. Friends, what is it that God wants? And pride, we can take pride in our stuff, in our things that God would want us to use for his kingdom. Some of us might deal with that, pride in our possessions. Some of us, it might be spiritual pride. I mentioned that. Pardon me. I'm nervous this morning, and so I know that I'm going to have to blow my nose a lot. Spiritual pride. I wear a veil. I understand the doctrine of predestination. My veil is bigger than that person's. What does that even mean? But don't tell me that you haven't thought of it. I'm talking to Mennonites here. Spiritual pride. What about prayer requests? Have you ever shared a prayer request that you yourself haven't prayed for? That's called sharing the news. I hate prayer sessions where people just share things they don't even care about. But it's somebody dealing with a really painful situation. If you haven't been praying about it, don't share it with others. It's not that close to your heart. What about long public prayers? Why? Jesus said that you are to avoid long public prayers and just vain, repetitious babblings, he called it. And man, do we do that. We are guilty, friends, but may God give us grace, and may we pursue humility. I don't mean to be critical. These are just some really practical things where I think it's easy to be proud. A critical spirit. The Pharisees invite Jesus to dinner with them. And it literally says, and you'll see this later, to watch him carefully. To be critical of him. A critical spirit is a proud spirit. Have you ever been present with believers where you felt, man, they're just watching me. They are just waiting for me to leave and they can talk about my clothing. Man, does that sound like the Pharisees? Friends, he gives grace, and we need it. And by the way, I am not pointing fingers. I deal with all of these things just like other people. And so I need the grace of God. May he help me to be humble, because that is the posture required to receive the grace of God. What is his desire? You know, we learn the humble brag pretty early in life, right? Excuse me. We know we ought to be humble, and so we might post about it. It's not hard to find a couple humble brags. I saw a homeless guy, here's a post, sitting in front of Walmart, and I was only getting one thing because I didn't have much money. But instead I bought a case of water and gave it to the man. Gave him my last money and walked away crying because I just felt God praising me for putting others before myself. And you are shortchanging yourself of the blessing. That's a humble brag. But we did it. You know, I remember being like in grade 1, 2, 8. No, kidding. Grade 1 or 2, we did our art piece, and we're so impressed with it, we hold it up to show it to other people, but point at it and shake our head. It's bad. It's bad. Isn't that the humble brag we're guilty of doing? Am I the only one who did that? We're guilty sometimes of still doing that. Here's another one that this baby made my day. I can remember when our baby was 2 years old, she had already mastered her ABCs and 1 to 10 counting. Currently, she's 3 years old and first honor in her nursery school. I like the comment, oh yeah, well my 3-year-old just got accepted into Harvard, so I'm proud of him. Nice. That's great. Here's another one, similar to the first. Just paid for someone's lunch at Wendy's on Bay Street. Enjoy your day. Isn't that great? Of course, comment sections are the best. Most people just do this without looking for recognition, just saying, but it's a nice gesture. Not looking for one, just wanted to say you're welcome. Well, most people wait for the thank you. Isn't that great? We're guilty of the same thing. How about this one? Such a very good quiet time with God this morning. He spoke to me through Luke 14. Seriously, guys, do yourself a favor. Get up at 5 a.m. and have ample quiet time. It will change your day every single time. Really? Did you just shortchange yourself of the blessing? This is what Jesus says. Be careful not to do your, Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before humans to be seen by them. If you do, you will get no reward from your Father which is in heaven. Should I read that again? If you do, you will get no reward from your Father which is in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with the trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and on the streets, to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they've received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees in secret will reward you. You see, this is between you and God. This is between me and God. And this is just some real stuff we deal with, isn't it? And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites who love praying in the street corners, long prayers. These are the words of Jesus. Standing in the synagogues, that would be the church. Do not be like those who love standing in the churches or on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth. You see, if you want an effective prayer, it comes down to the passion and the pursuit of your heart. It's not the words you're uttering. It is all about the heart. That's so cliche, but it's the truth. When you pray, Jesus says, go to your room, go into your closet, close the door and talk with your Father. If your prayers are not happening there, in your private space, according to Jesus, that is where prayer is rewarded. And then I I reference this verse, and when you pray, do not keep babbling like the pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Man, that's hard, Jesus. I'm doing my penance, aren't I? Going into long prayers. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you even ask. So, seeking humility. I like this definition. Perhaps humility is the key to the second command. Perhaps humility is the key to the second command. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's pretty tough to love your neighbor as yourself if you're not humble. But I do like this quote. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. Let me read that again. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. We're guilty of that, thinking this is humility. Oh, I'm just so bad. I'm just a poor guy. I'm just a worm. Thank you, God, for redeeming. Yeah, well, it's the truth. We're not all that special, meaning that we're sinners in need of grace. I'm guilty of sometimes saying that in the classroom. Those of you who have been there probably know this already. And I tell students, you're not special. That's a terrible message. But everything else, and I say it's your mom's job to tell you that you're special. It's it's my job to bring balance. That's what I tell them. Anyway, my point is this: we're all equal. We are equal. If you have believed in Jesus Christ, you are not just a worm. You are a redeemed saint. You have been made new, and you are going to live forever. That's a healthy perspective of who you are. That is a godly self-image. It is not one. This is one where you can lift your head up, not because you're proud, but because it's not because of what you have done, but because of what he has done every time. And when your salvation has anything connected to it, if your salvation has a doctrine connected to it, if your salvation is believing and anything else, it is a false statement. It is only in the finished work of Jesus Christ and believing in that. A healthy self-image is recognizing that we are completely lost and broken, not one person more than the other. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. We are made in God's image, dear friends. You and I, that's not physical. You are made in God's image. That is what he himself said, and Jesus quoted his Father with the same thing. And so a healthy self-image means that you recognize you are made in his image. And because of that, you're going to give yourself for others. You're going to serve. And so it is thinking of yourself less. We start thinking about our neighbor. Humility is thinking more of others. Humble people are focused on serving others. They don't think of themselves. It's the key to loving your neighbor as yourself. And perhaps it's the key to the first command as well, because since God opposes the proud. I attribute, and some say it is a C.S. Lewis quote, and I should just mention that because I couldn't find for sure. I'd like to go through a few verses. Psalms 25, verses 8 and 9. Good and upright is the Lord, therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. Humility. God, do you want to be led by God? Do you want to be taught by God? In both of those cases, it says it is for the humble. 1 Peter chapter 5, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you. Of course, we love the exaltation of humans, but Peter says, Humble yourself under his hand, and he will exalt you. Cast all of your cares on him, because he cares for you. Romans chapter 12, live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. And Philippians chapter 2, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility. Over and over, it's just saying, humility. Count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you not only look on your own interests, but also on the interests of others. And, pardon me. Finally, 1 John, sure, I'll read these verses. Do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, and don't we? Is this not the struggle? I love the world. I love money. Money is from the world. It is the world's system, and yet we often think of money as a blessing, and I suppose it is, but man, this is tricky. Money complicates so many things. All that is in the world, he writes, is the desires of the flesh and desires of the eyes and the pride of life. It's not from the Father, but it's from the world, and the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. Friends, let's be found in that will. I'm going to be drawing from Luke chapter 14. There's two parts here. The first is something that happens in a room, and then Jesus teaches in the second part. And the context, by the way, for Luke 14 is Luke 13. In Luke 13, Jesus is teaching. It says that he's going from town to town, and he's teaching, and someone asks him in verse 23, someone asks him, Lord, will those who are saved be only a few? And Jesus says this, strive. Another translation says, make every effort to get through the narrow door. For many, I tell you, will seek to enter, and they're not able. So what he's saying is here, it takes effort. Luke 13, verse 23, strive, make every effort to get through the narrow door. Many, he says, I tell you, will seek to enter, and they will not be able. When once the master of the house has risen and closed the door, they are going to say, Lord, open it for us. And he will answer, I don't know who you are, where you come from. And they say, but we ate with you, and we sat at your table, and you taught in our streets. And he says, well, some who are last will be first, and some who are first will be last. And so that is sort of the context here for the beginning of Luke 14. And I'd like to read these verses. One Sabbath, as he went to dine at the house of a prominent Pharisee, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before them who had dropsy, and Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, and he asked them a question. He said, now, it was a Sabbath, and he said, is it lawful for me to heal him today? And they couldn't answer. I mean, they were in an impossible place. They couldn't say no because that's just cruel. You couldn't say yes because that's not obeying the law. Friends, the message of Jesus, and I said this before, but the message of Jesus is believing in the finished work on the cross. And so he heals him. Well, what is dropsy? By the way, dropsy is a painful disease where we call it, today we call it edema. And it is when your small blood vessels, your capillaries, leak. And so the fluid just it gets into your body tissue, and you have swelling of limbs. It's uncomfortable. It hurts. And so Jesus is there. This guy, I don't know if he was invited or if he wandered in or if he was looking for Jesus or if the Pharisees brought him to test Jesus. I don't know. But he was there. And Jesus said, should I heal him? And they didn't answer. They knew they couldn't answer. And so he healed him. And then he says, who here, if your child or your animal or your puppy or your ox or your cow or your falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you're going to look at your child and say, I can't get you out today? You and I are guilty sometimes of putting certain positions ahead of what Jesus wants. And again, it says they couldn't reply to these things. There they stood, obeying the law, dressed right. I am not speaking critically of us or of our community, but we are guilty. We are guilty sometimes of dressing right, looking good, and acting as though somehow that gains benefit. Your dressing right should come out of a humble heart. That you, at that point, you say, I'm not going to do that or wear that. It's not appropriate for me. It's not because you are gaining any benefit. You are not getting closer to God per se. And I've been guilty. I've been guilty of sometimes this especially. And as I'm teaching my children, teaching them that this is appropriate, what they need to understand is the heart needs to come to a proper posture before God, because out of your heart flows everything else. That's what Jesus taught. We are so guilty sometimes of the same spiritual pride. Let's go on to and so they couldn't answer to these things. And so here he goes on, he tells them a parable to those who were there. And when he noticed, so it says, when he noticed, so remember the Pharisees came to watch him, but a keener eye was watching them. And it says, when he noticed how they chose their places of honor. Now understand this. He said this, at a wedding feast, now they would have been sitting around a table here. So, and this table that they were gathered around was called a triclinium. It is a U-shaped table. And your host would be at the head of the table, of the U. And then it was like being at a wedding, right? When you go to a wedding, you don't really have to wonder who the guests of honor are. You can just look and see. When you, and you don't have to try to figure out who's at the head table, right? It's pretty obvious. And then your honored guests are closer to the table, and eventually you get back to table 13. That's similar to this. And people would come to these, and they would try to get a place of honor. The closer you are to the host, the more honorable it was. There were some that didn't even get to the table. Some were just in the room. They just came. They may not have gotten food. There were some that didn't get inside. Those guests have no honor. And that's what this gives this parable a completely, maybe a clarified meaning. And he says this, he's noticed how they got to their places of honor. And he says, so when you're invited to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you might come yet. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this person, right? So if the wedding starts at 2 p.m. and you wander in at 1:59 and you see, there's still a spot way up at the front of the sanctuary, and you go and sit there, and the usher needs to come up and say, sorry, this is Nana's seat. You're going to be embarrassed. And they will usher you to the balcony where they intended for you to be. What an embarrassment. That's the same thing here. And he says, so when you are invited, go and sit in the balcony. And when the host sees, they're going, where is Gary? And they see him in the balcony, and the host tells the usher, go up there. I have a seat up here for him. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Pardon me. Friends, it is simply in how we view and think about those around us. Just the next 2 verses yet. And just keep thinking about this wedding. And he also said also to the man who had invited him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, don't invite your friends or your brothers or relatives or neighbors, lest they invite you back, and you'll be repaid. But when you give a party, when you host a feast, go out, and again, he's standing in this room, the triclinium is before him, and he is looking out the door. And he's saying, when you host a party, those people out there, bring them in and give them a place of honor. When you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they can't repay you. Understand that in this first century, these people were social outcasts. They themselves believed that they had no belonging at a party. They were not fit for a feast. Friends, this is important. If you believe that you have fallen too far, you have strayed too long, and you are an outcast, you are whatever it is that happened to you, and you are on the outside looking in, this message is for you. Sometimes we miss the invitation. Sometimes we miss what it's all about. Sometimes we miss who's invited, and if you think you only invite people that agree with you, you're going to find heaven to be awfully lonely. Truth is, going to be people in heaven that we're not even allowing into our homes. It's kind of a scary thought, is it not? So when we talk about the poor, the crippled, or the lame, friends, just think about the social outcasts. Those who would say, "No, I'm not. We're not in the same social class." May our tables and our homes be opened to bring them in. And I wish I would have time to get into the next parable. That's where Jesus goes on with the wedding feast, and he says, he gave invitations and some of them couldn't come. And he said, go out into the highways and byways and country lanes. Friends, those country lanes are even further cast out. They were not even fit for the cities. That's who was in the country in the first century. And he said, bring them in, because my feast. And of course, this is just a subtle allusion to the feast you and I all want to be part of when we get there in heaven, right? That's what this is a subtle allusion to. And I'm not talking here about overlooking sin, but we all have that. Everyone needs to believe, and everyone needs grace. You see, if Jesus only invited those who could pay him back, his table would be empty. Think about that. If Jesus would only invite those who could pay him back, the table would be empty. This, friends, is a feast of grace. Everyone belongs. Everyone is welcome at the table. Everyone. It doesn't matter where you've been or where you come from. You belong at the table because he has invited you. The invitation has your name on it. Isn't that amazing? And everyone is an honored guest. It is a feast of grace. The more undeserving of grace you feel, the better a place you are in to receive it. Think about that. The more undeserving you feel. If you feel like, man, yeah. We all feel I think those of us who are spiritual are guilty of this sometimes. You know, God's pretty lucky to have me on his team. Man. Or, I deserve grace. No. Grace is undeserved. And the more undeserving of grace you feel, the better a place you are in to receive it. Friends, it's time to close. James chapter 4, verse 10. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Friends, open your doors, lengthen your tables, invite others to come, and let them know that they are deserving. Well, we're all undeserving. Let them know that they are as deserving as anyone else. The invitation is grace-driven. And this is a feast of grace that Jesus invites us to. May you be encouraged this morning, regardless of what your story has been, to come to the table, because the table has a place setting intended for you. May God bless each of us to that end.